Today's episode of the Girlfriend God podcast is brought to you by New World Women, and I'm joined for a preview to New World Women with one of the co-founders, Dawn Morningstar. So, Dawn, you tell me that New World Women is poised to be the largest, now I can't think of the tagline, the largest
You're almost there.
women.
And we are
Okay.
poised to be the largest collaborative women's self-empowerment organization in the world. Yeah, we are. Hey, Kelly, thanks for taking some time to talk about New World Women, which I know is close and dear to each of our hearts. So why should women join New World Women or even take a peek at it, which they can do by going to newworldwomen.com. It's because New World Women welcomes and supports women of all races, cultures, ethnicities, socioeconomic backgrounds, and religious and spiritual beliefs. So we are an organization that has been born out of the divine feminine. Our whole model is created by women for women. And what we are doing is providing an online, on-demand learning platform that includes a lot of inspiration. Also, access to our astounding community. You've begun meeting some of the women in our community, right?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. And the third thing that we're doing that is quite unique is we are making it possible for women to add to their prosperity in their lives without selling anything or doing anything that makes them feel uncomfortable. It's a very unique and innovative model that we've created. So I'm pretty thrilled about it. It is the culmination of my life's work after 37 years as a women's self-empowerment coach. And I know the time is now. You had asked me that a while ago. Is it time? And yes, it is time for women to come into the fullness of their being, come together and create a new world.
Fabulous.
Welcome to The Girlfriend God, a podcast in search of and in service to the divine feminine, bringing you an equal mix of academic research and emotional spiritual experience. If you enjoy this podcast, be sure to subscribe, follow, rate it, review it, and share it with your friends. Now, together, let's find the divine.
Okay, welcome to another episode of the Girlfriend God. First, today's episode, I'm fortunate to be joined by our guest co-host, Dominique Bryant Williams, the community organizer for Woman Spirit Reclamation. Dominique, welcome back. And today, I know we're both really excited to welcome Max Dashu to the show. Max founded the Suppressed Histories Archives in 1970 to research and document global women's history. She built a collection of 15,000 slides and 30,000 digital images and has created 150 visual talks on female cultural heritages from the most ancient times to the present. She's an internationally known expert on ancient goddess iconography, matricultures, and female spheres of power, patriarchy and allied systems of domination, medicine women, female shamans, witches, and the witch hunts. She's also the author of Witches and Pagans, Women in European Folk Culture, and she's just recently published Women in Greek Mythography. I knew I was going to struggle with that. And in 2024, she'll release Women's Power in Greek Patriarchy, Priestesses, Amazons, and Witches. All of these books belong to a 15-volume series called The Secret History of Witches. A 15-book series. I have to say, that is indeed impressive. And let me just say, Max, I think I can speak for both myself and Dominique when I say, for us, you are a legend. So,
well,
with that, Max, welcome to the show.
well, thank you for inviting me. You know, it's funny about the volumes because it was going to be a book, but what were chapters turned into volumes because as I uncovered more things, it just had to keep splitting and splitting. and it's actually up to 16 now, because even just this one, which is volume 2, the Hellenic material,
Right.
it came up past 800 pages, and I knew I had to cut it in half. So it's book 1 and book 2. Volume 2 is.
I have trouble writing just one, let alone
Yeah.
15, 16. So I think that's fantastic. Dominique sent me a list of questions, and there's some things I want to ask you about. But before we get into that, I want to ask you about. I've talked a lot lately with women I know how important it is that we create this intergenerational dynamic. So I think it's really poignant that today, in recording this episode, there are 3 generations of us women who are goddess seekers, who are goddess spirituality seekers, who are history seekers. And I'm wondering about your thoughts on that. Do you agree that this intergenerational learning is important because we have to know our history in order to create better futures, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And there's been a lot of conversation lately about the interruption of the women's movement, the schisms, and the cutting off of intergenerational transmission. And there's a book called Hags by Victoria Smith that just came out of UK. And she's very concerned with this. And I know a lot of women in the lesbian community are too, because there's been this absolute rupture, in that transmission in many cases. And she notes that while for men, they have legacy men that they can look up to. There's no challenge to those heroic figures. But for women, she says, instead what we have is waves of movement that crash and then recede. That there's these cyclic deviations from the movement. And Gerda Lerner, who wrote numerous books, The Creation of Patriarchy is one of them, but then she came up with a later book on the creation of feminist consciousness. And she, in studying just the Western civ cultural record, was able to see how women would come forward and bring forward female history, women of the past, would analyze the Bible and all these foundational texts and try to find the women in them and try to critique the patriarchy in them. And then it would just be dropped and they would be washed from the record. And then the next generation of women coming up didn't know that this had ever been done before, and they would have to reinvent the wheel again and again and again, as if nothing had ever happened before. So there is this, it's a pattern, and patriarchal backlash has a lot to do with the way that this takes place. And so I feel that it's very important. And currently I'm looking for younger women to become involved with the Suppressed Histories archives, because, I've been at this for a long time, but, I want participation. I'm looking for volunteers to help us with I have I don't even know, there might be 15,000 Facebook pages that are migrated into the website, but we have to create navigation pages and then tag all the content. So what's on there, it's on the site, nobody can find it because it's just a bunch of numbers.
Right.
The URLs tell you nothing.
Right.
So that they can put in priestess, goddess, woman warrior, whatever it may be, or countries, right, or peoples, and find what they're looking for, because it's in there. And what I kind of blog on the Suppressed Histories archives page on Facebook. It's a lot easier than making web pages and uploading them. So I've been doing that since 2010. And there's a huge amount of resources there, but the task of this coming year is going to get that all available to people so they can find what they're looking for. The Malawian oracle women, and, just so many different amazing archaeological finds and temples and megalithic cultures, and including this Hellenic material I've been working with, which I have to say, really I came kicking and screaming to this book because we all had Greece and Rome shoved down our throats,
right.
In the educational system. And it's like, no, I don't want this. And it's so patriarchal. But what I'm trying to do in the entire series, which is called Secret History of the Witches, is to bring another angle of view on that cultural record, because we need to know the origins of rape culture, which I talk about in this book. And we need to know the colonizations that happened and the patterns of that were laid down, hero worship, literal hero worship of military raiders and slavers and rapists, right? Who had shrines and ceremonies all over the Greek world, and how that set a pattern for Tom Cruise movies, the whole culture of first dime novels, then comic books, movies, all of the adventure dramas, and the kinds of narratives, James Bond movies, with girl on each arm, girl in quotes. So if we try to center women, and it's difficult because the reason I use the word mythography is that mythology, I just wanted, again, a different angle. It's not only what's written, but it's also all the depictions, the whole entire cultural record, not just what elite men wrote, but images of the water divinities. Sorry about that. Nava, can you get that? You're going to have to edit that out.
That's okay.
There are other images, and what was popular among the common people. So the Olympian gods, that's all over. We see that's what's shoved down our throat.
Right.
Even under brand names, or the Olympics or marathons, all these references back to Greek civilization. But what they don't show us is the positive images. And in terms of the goddesses, this is really important because the Olympians are not the whole story. Right. There's an older generation of deities that go back very deep in time. Are you hearing that buzzing in the background? He's now weed eating. I can move.
Oh, no.
Okay, good.
No, you're good. And I hear what you're saying, Max, because I hear what you're saying, just because I know a lot of this. And I'm often shocked when people really don't have any idea that there's a mythological record beyond the Greco-Roman mythology. Like there are mythologies all over the world. And as you say, mythologies that extend back much to a much earlier time period, and things that get lost in the shuffle, right? Like you mentioned the Olympics, and whenever the Olympics come on, I'm always like, do you know the Olympic flame is a nod to the goddess Hestia? And people are like, what?
Well, and not only that, but the first Olympic races. So the name comes from Olympia in Western Greece, okay, in the province of Elis. The first races in Olympia were girls racing for Hera. The oldest temple at Olympia was of Hera. Zeus's temple didn't come till 150 years later. Okay. And so then later the men horn in, and that's okay. They can have their races, but they would alternate years because this was like an innovation.
Right.
And this is just one of the many things that is not known about where things originate. In the case of the deities, my first chapter is called Titanides, which means female titans. And the titans, which you've probably heard of, are referred to as the old gods or the former gods.
Right.
Theoi proteroi in Greek. And they are nature divinities. They don't have the same patriarchal narrative. There's a few pieces of it because it gets strained through classical patriarchal sources. But this is where what I took as my starting point. And I do also analyze what Hera was like before she, what Jane Harrison calls her, the conquered but never submitted native princess, something to that effect. The Indo-European invasions laid over the indigenous cultures of mainland Greece and what happened there, right? But the Titanides are really interesting because these are cosmogonies. They're about the birth of the universe and origin stories. And so we have Haos, which is the great void that is like the source of all being, who parthenogenetically gives birth to Nux, night. And night is this very important figure that I talk about at length, some very interesting philosophies around her as an oracular figure, as a mother of all the deities. And then from her come earth and heaven and sea. Well, actually, it's earth and earth gives birth to heaven and sea. That's the way it goes. But anyway, these titanitas are fascinating, and the imagery of them, especially in the old black figure paintings, is really interesting, because you will see Thetis, who's a really important figure in these philosophies, as a woman driving a chariot, and she has dolphins in either hand because she is the head of the Nereids. She's got her 50 sisters of the sea goddesses, and she is a creatrix in the oldest sources. So we have, like, in around 700, this poet in Sparta named Alcman. There are fragments that survive of his work, and he talks about her as a creatrix who in the beginning laid out Poros, the way, and Tekmor, the destination. And there's a lot of other translations for those terms. But she is a creator figure who in other legends referred to in the Iliad also saves Zeus. So he owes her one, but he betrays her because there's a prophecy that one of her offspring will be more powerful than him. And there's this legend, this patriarchal line of overthrow. So Kronos overthrows his father Uranus, and then Zeus overthrows Kronos. And now Zeus is looking over his shoulder, thinking that any following divinity of enough power could overthrow him. So he plots to bring down Thetis. And I talk about that in another chapter called The Myths of Conquest, because he wants to basically make sure that her child will not be fully divine. So he forces her into a captivity marriage with a mortal. And
Right.
So there's this way mythically that Thetis begins as this really powerful being and is brought low and subjugated under the Olympian gods. And this is the story we hear of from the Iliad, where she goes supplicating at the feet of Zeus. And right. but there is one part there where Achilles reminds Zeus that he owes a favor to Thetis because it was she who saved him and brought the 100-handed Briareos to protect him and free him from his bonds. And so he owes her a boon. One might ask, however, if that is the case, why was, if I leave that part out. Never mind. I don't want to go into too much detail. But
I'm also often surprised, not just that people don't know that there's other mythology, but that people don't know that there are thousands of other creation stories and creation myths outside of that. But, I'm also coming from the Midwest and living in Christian nation central. So right. Things might be a little different elsewhere.
I grew up in Illinois,
Yes, I did know that.
But yeah,
but you were in Chicago, right?
No, West Chicago, very different.
Oh, West Chicago.
Out there by Geneva. A little railroad town. The thing about what you're saying that's really interesting is that both with the Greeks and the Norse, when I really did these deep dives into the mythic material, the way it's presented to us, like when you pick up a book, whether it's a really high level college book or even, the stories, mythology, Greek mythology for the kids, they make it seem like there's just this set narrative. This is the mythology. This is what it looks like. But in reality, there are all these wild variations, and some of them are regional, right, and have to do with particular ceremonies in that city or that part of Greece, and others are just completely different stories. So this is one of the things that we have to realize how mediated everything that comes to us is. There are clearly going to be huge chunks missing that we can't recover. But my task in this book was to dig out the nuggets of things that survive, the oracular women. There's a whole thing about oracles of Ge, who is later called Gaia, the Earth Mother. And, that's just like a really a substratum of culture that's pretty much disregarded. The scholars aren't really interested in that.
Yeah, Max, I just want to jump in. I love what you're saying about, kind of the roots that you uncover like Greek mythology because I'm a mixed race person and I have African ancestry, so I do really dive into like African
Right.
mythology. But I always ask myself, like, I'm still very drawn to Greek mythology and Roman mythology, and I kind of ask myself why. But I really think it's because this is the culture that I'm indoctrinated in, right? Like I'm
Yeah.
trying to unpack the roots of the culture that I've grown up surrounded by. Because when you look into
Exactly.
the deeper mythologies of Greek mythology, you actually start to see the layers of the
Yeah.
stories that we've been encultured under. So I find that really fascinating and really exciting,
Well,
actually.
this is why, against all much of my inclination, I finally just dug in to do this book because it is an act of decolonization. Even from the European side, to see that there's this other history, and of course we have the deep history, Maria Gimbutas, the old Europe archaeology, and I've done research on this as well myself. And certainly the Cretan. I don't really go that deep into the Cretan material in this book because that's a whole book in itself. I'm going to have that as a visual presentation instead. But in, I mean, one of the things that happens in researching this, and I'm looking at the ceramic painting is a really important part of the cultural record for the Greek world. And it's very interesting because first you have the Mycenaeans, and their culture in many ways resembles that of Crete. Turns out the genome researchers have discovered in the last 5 years that they are related ethnically to the Cretans. It wasn't just Indo-Europeans on the mainland and indigenous Cretans on the island. They had a shared, probably language as well as bloodline, and they had also cultural differences because the mainland Greeks have steppe ancestry. There is, like, the Indo-European invasions coming in from the direction of Ukraine that colonized, and maybe they weren't even the first. Maybe the Proto-Greeks weren't even the first layer of invasions, because that's pretty late. 2200 BCE is when they think they came in. But Crete was on an island, and so they were protected from a lot of the military madness of the Bronze Age. The sea protected them, and they were actually a sea power, a trading society. But so these Mycenaean societies conquer Crete, and you have this very domination-based culture. The Mycenaeans are slave raiders as well as traders. So I talk in the book about enslavement, and particularly women in Asia. And they're named, the women from Lesbos, the women from Asua, which is, the word Asia actually comes from a Hittite word for northwestern Anatolia. And so there's this whole traffic and slaving going on. But then the militarization, basically they imploded. What they call the sea peoples that included the Mycenaeans collapse, and they bring down the Ugaritic civilization. They bring down the Hittite Empire. Egypt survives, but it loses its imperial provinces in Asia. And then there's this gap, which they refer to as a dark age, but there's just not a lot of cultural activity visible for a couple 100 years. And then there comes up what they call the geometric period, named after a style of ceramic painting that begins around 1000 BCE. And from somewhere between 900 and 800, 900 and 700, a style of ceramic painting comes up that's really fascinating because there's now, instead of just geometric patterns, there's human figures. And a lot of them are funerary scenes. And women were very prominent in the mourning. So you'll see women with their arms raised above their head in the same mourning gesture that we see in the Mycenaean larnakes, the coffins, the ossuaries. And here's the thing about it. As I'm looking at this imagery, I'm seeing African profiles on the people. The style of representation of the human figure with the shoulders forward, the head in profile, and the body again turned sideways, that's an African motif, which is visible not only in Egyptian art, where the men and women are always very slim, but even more so in the older Saharan rock art tradition, including that of Libya, where Libya in particular has a style that looks closer to this Greek geometric figure painting than anything else in the world. The women have locks or twists on their heads, right? And there are just a variety of indicators. Sometimes they even have naps. Okay, it's just like the older style really shows that somehow Libyan people had cultural input into Greece in this period. And this is a period where there's nothing being written. They've lost Linear B. We don't have anything written. We only have the archaeological record. But here's the interesting thing. So first I notice this Libyan connection in the archaeology. And I don't know what the genome is going to say. So far, I haven't found any genomic connection. It may be that this was really only a cultural influence, But the other thing is that Greek literature talks about a Libyan migration into Argos. And this is a family of sisters, 50 sisters. So this is kind of a mythic number. The Danaides, the daughters of Danaus, who is the king of Libya. And there's a cycle of plays about them that Aeschylus and other Greek dramatists wrote about this. There's various references to it. And they come from Africa and seek refuge in Argos because they are going to be forcibly married to the 50 sons of Aegyptus, the king of Egypt. And so they're fleeing a forced marriage. So some of those plays are lost, but there's one called The Suppliants that survives, and I analyze this in chapter 2. But there's even more, because the name, the Danaides, as they're called in the playwrights, but in older sources, the Danaoi are also named in the Iliad and other texts of the epic cycle. So there's like several different names for the Greeks. Nobody called themselves Mycenaeans. They're either the Achaioi or the Danaioi or what's the other one? Like blanking out on it. I'll come to me later. But anyway, it turns out that these names, particularly the Tanayu or the Danan, are mentioned in Egyptian inscriptions as early as the 14th century BCE. So they knew these Greeks, and they are definitely Greeks because the place names that they are in connection with are names for Sparta, names for different parts of Greece, and right next door to mentions of the Cretans. So there are real people that had this name. And then there's this whole mythologizing around it by the time you get to the classical playwrights, that they are talking about these as being Libyan women. And in the play, the Suppliants, the king of Argos, looks at them and says, I think you are African women. You are not like us Greeks. So there's this literary testimony, and as well as inscriptional testimony to the Danoi or the Danaides. And so there again, you have one line of evidence from the archaeology, a very African-looking style, another line of evidence from the written records saying, oh yeah, we think some Libyans came here and they founded a dynasty in Argos, which had already it was one of the longest inhabited cities in Greece. So this is kind of a different angle. I mean, you're probably familiar with the book Black Athena, and his thesis in that book was that Egyptians had colonized Greece at a very early period, like maybe around 2000 BCE or so. And his linguistic evidence is very dodgy. But I'm saying that there was an African influence, just not the one he thought. Basically, boil it down.
With the scientific research now and more studies on genomes and DNA, and I think that we'll find more of that things well, that's what happens with history, right? I mean, we learn more, and then things we once thought were true are replaced with another thing that we then think is true. Like just as a simple example, for decades, I was taught that that Mesopotamia was the cradle of civilization. Right. Now they're not so sure about that.
No, standing narratives get overthrown.
Right. Now they think, Anatolia and Turkey and Siberia as the birth of a lot of things. And
it's not to forget Egypt and Sudan.
Right. It's interesting to see how that changes over time. So, which is kind of makes me kind of question everything, right? I mean, I'm from the generation of, I was raised to believe my mother always told me, don't believe anything you hear and only half of what you read.
Good for
I
her.
love that. There's this site in Turkey, and they call it Göbekli Tepe, which means like pot-bellied. It's this big mound, and they unearthed this huge array of like sculptures and pillars and buildings, and they date back to almost 12,000 years ago. And that new information, I think this was discovered maybe the late 90s, I don't know, but that discovery put into question where is the cradle of civilization. And I find that super fascinating. And it's also interesting because there's this one pillar there, and it's called Pillar 43, and they call it the vulture stone. And it depicts a vulture like pointing to a sun, and then there's like a scorpion beneath it. And so they think it was showing like how the sky looked when a certain event happened. They think maybe it was
Mm,
showing extinction event. I'm not quite sure. Maybe
mhm,
like what happened, they call it the Younger Dryas, where there was this huge ice age that like really kind of
mhm.
jacked up civilization. But it's just interesting. Like I'm really drawn to vultures. I'm also drawn to the vulture-headed goddesses that I have seen in your archive. And so
Mhm.
it's just interesting the way the information is always shifting. And I look
Yeah.
at those pillars and they feel like messages, and you wonder like, what is this message, and how do I connect that to my
And how do
life? I
we how
feel
do
like
we read it? How do we read it? And
exactly.
it's like a lot of this is pattern recognition too, because like say the theme of the vulture, right? Where does that turn up elsewhere? And in the Kemetic culture, I mean, we see those pre-dynastic vulture-headed goddesses, right? And then later there's Nechebet, who is a vulture goddess. But the word Mut in Kemetic means both mother and vulture. So you have to have a hieroglyphic radical added to the character for each of them to distinguish which is meant. But there's their homophones, I guess you could say. The thing about Göbekli Tepe and really all of this, I mean, there it has so much to do with the presumptions of the European, especially the British archaeologists that were excavating and looking at all of this. And they had this idea of great civilizations. Where is the point of superiority from which all these things emerge? They want to name it that way. It really kind of blew their minds when they discovered, because one of the received dogmas had become that civilization comes through agriculture, and that you can't have quote unquote high culture without that. And then here's Göbekli Tepe, who are foraging society. They're not doing agriculture, right? So they're hunting, they're gathering, and that that changes the narrative. Just as we could look at some other societies in the world that are really complicated that farming civilization story, like the Pacific Northwest, where they had very rich and stratified societies who were again foraging. They were fishers, they were hunters, they were not farmers. So the assumptions, it constantly just, I felt like when I began doing this research, I had to question everything. It was like, it's all patriarchal narratives, it's all colonial. There's all this racism pervading the way everything is looked at, so that some of the societies where women's status was actually the highest are totally ignored. Who ever heard of Sumatra and the Minangkabau people? When I began my research, it took a real while for me to locate where these major cultures were actually located. But inevitably, they're located in places that we're never told about in what they give us of history. Nobody's looking at Tanzania. Nobody's looking at Malawi, as far as the dominant historical picture is concerned. So
Well,
there's several,
I'm
several,
sorry, go
several
ahead.
because there's the archaeological, there's the rock art, and then there's also indigenous orature. When you go to the library, if you're looking for Tanzania, then you get in there and you see there are all these colonial reports about where the offices were established and where the metals could be mined and what other resources could be extracted, taxation, all these things, but not an interest in the peoples and their historical narratives. So for that, you have to go to a different part of the library and see if you can dig something up out of the ethnographers who have their own biases. A lot of times I would find an amazing story about some first woman, the foundational female cultural hero or ancestral woman, and I'd find just a piece of it. And then it could be like 25 years later, I'd find the rest because they had only highlighted part. They weren't really interested. Joe Marler talks about how Maria Gimbutas, when she was on archaeological excavations, actually witnessed a male archaeologist pick up one of the female figurines and throw it over the edge of the site because it was just, he wasn't interested in it. They wanted, right. They love to catalog the flint points and, lots of numbers, but, she was interested in what the mythic narratives of those societies were. What was the cultural content, and not only the technological.
Dominique, there was something else that I lost my list now because I closed too many windows. You had mentioned that you wanted to ask about pre-dynastic Kemetic priestesses. Max, can you speak to that? Or Dominique, do you have a specific question?
Well, she did mention them a little bit. They do have the vulture-headed women and goddesses. I think I'm just so curious about that period because those were some of the images that were most striking to me. That pottery that depicts, they're called the invoking women, and they have their hands over their head like this.
Yeah, yeah.
And I'm just so drawn to them. I don't know what exactly it is. I think, they have, a lot of them had afro hair. Most of them had afro hair, and they're doing this shape. And it just kind of gave me this message of like, oh my gosh, like we've always been here. And they're literally invoking, like they're in these, I don't want to say, this isn't hierarchical, but they're in like a high position, a spiritual position. And they're doing, I don't know what, but I'm just so drawn to the pre-dynastic Kemetic priestesses, the vulture, to hear you comment on the word for vulture also meaning mother without the certain intonation. I'm just finding that so fascinating. And a big reason for that is I see vultures all the time. And I go to Glendora to dog sit, and I'm like right by the hills, and the vultures love to be by the hills because all the nature is there. And sometimes the vultures will come out and they'll circle, and I'll be outside and I'll be dancing and I'll be playing music, and the vultures will literally like swoop in. This has happened.
They
like
come
two
to
times.
see. They're seeing the energy. It's like, what's this going on? Let's check it out.
And I just love it. Like I've even seen like almost 20 vultures like gathering and circling, and that felt more like in the distance. But yeah, it was just so. I'm in awe, especially the fact that they've been so significant for thousands of years, and we don't revere vultures in our cultures anymore. So
yeah, I don't know if you saw, I do have a taste of the pre-dynastic visual talk on YouTube. So there's like maybe 12 minutes or something. I have the full presentation on stream on demand on the Suppress Histories portal over on Teachables that you can see it. But in there I talk about, there's actually, I think I came up with 5 lines of evidence for these invoking women. There is rock art of them. There's, of course, the figurines that we've talked about here. There's, very importantly, the painted pottery, what they call the D-ware pottery, between 4000 and 3000 BCE. Multiple instances of these invoking women. And, just a sidebar on that, because a point I was trying to make in the Woman Shaman DVD that I made is we can't really tell if it's intended to be a divinity, a priestess calling in the divinity, or even an ancestral woman. Though the borderlines to that are very narrow, and to some degree, how can we even draw such a line? Because if the priestess is calling the goddess into her body, then, what difference does that really make? It's just a completely different cultural approach to it. But there are also images of the women in murals, and I think there's one painted linen that also has this motif. So it's very, very widespread through different media. It's like, I would say it's the key image, along with a lot of the animals, of course, of pre-dynastic Kemetic culture.
It's fascinating what comes up when we research. And back to the beginning of our conversation about this intergenerational learning, I feel like that's been part of the disconnect, right? Because we've literally been changing our brains over time, and with each generation, they have shorter and shorter attention spans, and everything's on a screen. And so, those of us who like to do that kind of research, I feel like we're a dying breed. But of course, then I meet somebody like Dominique, who is very into doing her own research and reading. But I feel like that's kind of that women like you, Dominique, are kind of few and far between. But you also know I'm kind of curmudgeon-y about these things, just based on what I see where I live and having been in academia and just all of that. I'm trying to be more hopeful that young people will, the women I've been talking to lately, we reminisce about having to go to the library and do our own research and find our own things rather than just Googling something and getting what may or may not be relevant information. And I want to say, what do I want to say? When we talk about, was this a depiction of a goddess or a priestess invoking a goddess, or just a woman who had a position of spiritual authority in a particular tribe or a particular people? So the book that I'm currently working on is about the goddess Ellen of the Ways, which that's a whole other discussion about whether she is in fact a goddess, or my argument, which is that she's just a collection of tropes and symbolisms that cross millennia. Like, I didn't know until I started researching that there was this book that was obviously somebody's dissertation about the deer goddess of ancient Siberia. And what I learned in the deer goddess of ancient Siberia is that, and of course I can't think of names and dates off the top of my head, but there were these depictions of what is obviously a female character with horns.
Yeah.
In
Trying to think the name of that
Siberia.
author, the woman that wrote
I can't think of her name either.
I cannot bring it up, but I know who you mean.
But
Well,
it's
and
just so fascinating. And I think we've touched on this a little bit here today, right? That if you look hard enough, everything is cyclical and everything is cross-cultural. Or maybe not everything is cross-cultural, but a lot of stuff is, right? Like, the basis of a creation myth is the same no matter what the creation myth is. The basis of the Santa Claus is a good example, right? There's not just the Santa Claus that we know in American culture. That is a myth that goes back from millennia and also crosses many different cultures. And I think a lot of these things, like I said, if we do the research and we look hard enough, we'll see, oh, this thing existed over here also. And oh, I thought this thing originated in Egypt, but actually it's from Indonesia or whatever. You know what I mean? It's just, but there's just
there's two different ways that this happens, and there's been big brawls over this in anthropology. One is things arising independently, maybe out of some basic human interface with the natural world, that felines have to do with solar power and frogs have to do with lunar, that kind of thing.
Right.
And the other is the diffusionists, which talks about things spreading, and both happen. I think an exclusive approach of either of those frameworks is, it can become absolutist, because a totally diffusionist thing always says, oh, it's got to start someplace and everybody else borrowed it. And then a totally independent arising analysis, you miss out on the fact that there were cultural motifs that spread. Like, for example, the Egyptian sun with wings. And this gets picked up by the Hittites and the Mesopotamians. And, there's the spread that we can actually track, or the Halafian culture, very early Neolithic ceramic goddesses that begin in northern Syria and spread out as far as Iran and into Phoenicia, before it was Phoenicia. So, but I want to go back to what you were saying about the digital world, because I think that there is a fracturing and a disembodying aspect to it, right? That is really so accelerated. It's kind of dangerous to the human neurology. I mean, I'm very neurodivergent, so I feel this myself, because the other part of it is, I mean, we're able to connect on Zoom and do this conversation, which would not be possible otherwise unless I had come to Champaign, right? And Dominique. But I have to say that there's another issue, which is that my research has expanded massively because online research, it's not just the really not I don't want to say authoritative, the dubious kinds of stuff that you see all over the place online, you know, but there are scholars that are publishing their work open access, and you're getting really high quality detailed analysis, including studies by native scholars of indigenous cosmology and history, or also the images. Because one of the problems that I faced, starting in the just a year of 54 years ago, in the fall of 1969, and I began scanning around the planet, looking, where are women free, and where are there other cultural models? Because I left college because my anthropology professor told me there is no society in which men do not dominate. That was dogma, and it still is dogma in a lot of those settings. So I was looking at books, but everything is mediated, and especially then, it's much, much better now in publication. Everything is mediated through gatekeepers. It's the author, it's the illustrations they pick, it's the editor, and what's going to be the big color plates, and especially this is true of the overarching studies, like in that period there was like the dawn of man, and the big color pictures of warriors and kings, dynasts. And maybe they'd have a little tiny black and white photo of a female figurine, but nothing that was important, And so the bias of the gatekeepers has been really a huge thing. And so I have found so many more images from the archaeology of the Niger Delta, the inland delta of the Niger in Mali, various different cultural traditions. So I've been able to just increase my archives by leaps and bounds, instead of like going to the library, dragging the book home, taking a copy camera, taking the film in, developing it, bringing it back, stripping the slide and labeling it. I drag a JPEG to my desktop and then I label it. And, sometimes I have to do a little more background, that can take me down a whole rabbit hole, because what else is online now that I've found this site name, right? But the other problem with that, and this, I ran into this recently because I found a really good site about the archaeology of the mound building cultures in the woodlands of Eastern North America. So that within the whole river system of the Ohio, the whole web, the whole tree of these rivers that occupies half the continent, there were these mound building cultures that had a lot of shared symbolism. And so there are figurines both in clay and in stone. There are mica and copper platters or bone carved objects. And so I'm just like, I found a whole trove and I was downloading it. There are offering pots in the form of animals with kind of a stovepipe neck on the pot, and this is a global pattern because we find those in Argentina and Vietnam, in Egypt, in the Balkans, all these different places, but in the Czechia. But some of the figurines I found, because I'm always looking for those female figurines. Oh, look, here's a new one. And I gradually began to realize, because I had just downloaded them, and I started looking at them, and it's like, you know what? This is a fake. So this is our other problem with the online research. There are loads of fakes out there, and there's certain cultures that get picked up on because there's money to be made. Oh, look, we're not really sure where this came from, but, a worker found this in the field somewhere, and, let's put it on the market for the collectors to buy an authentic Malian inland Niger Delta figurine, right? And there's also looting going on is the other thing, because desperately impoverished people are selling this stuff to the international collectors market, but they're not getting the money. It's the middlemen. So there are certain areas like northeastern China There are lots of fakes for the Hongshan culture. There are loads of fakes for the Colombian gold workers. And so this is another challenge, is that you have to be able to pick that out. And even the museum experts are fooled. And there's been some scandals about this because they find that the Met has things in their collection. It's like, you know what? This is really not authentic.
Right.
Aside from the question of how it was stolen in the first place,
Right.
But,
Right. I mean, I often say technology is both, I have a love-hate relationship with technology. And I think as AI continues to grow, hopefully Google will eventually have. I always imagine a feature of Google where when you Google something, it says, "Do you want the short answer or the long answer?"
yeah.
And then directs you to, varied search results.
Yeah, or like the
Uh,
fact check on Twitter where people can challenge and say, you know what, this object is not authentic,
right, right.
because it fools a lot of people.
It does. Um, so we're at about an hour. I just want to check in and see. I know that Dominique, I know you had a few more questions, and there was one particular thing that I wanted to ask about. Are you good with our time, Max?
We can keep going.
Okay. So I wanted to ask about female shamans because that seems to be another area in which we we are indoctrinated, right? The image of the shaman is always as male, but I have read about multiple cultures where the women were shamans, and I wanted to ask you about that, if you could cite us some examples. And I was wondering if there are any tribes or peoples in which strictly the women are shamans.
Yeah. Okay, well that's a complicated question. I mean, this is the medicine women, the female oracles, the seeresses, there's all these culturally specific names. So that there's a controversy around using the word shaman. But
Right, because I
my
know that
my
the
my
word
position,
shaman is actually an academic
no,
construct,
no, well,
right?
percent, yeah. I mean, it originates in the Tungusic cultures of northeastern Asia. Okay, so what happened is the anthropologists borrowed that word, or you could say they appropriated it, but they in European languages, most of the names for these kinds of people had long ago been excised by the witch hunts, and various other persecutions. So they were lacking in language, which is why you see the borrowing of a lot of words like mana or taboo, which both come from Pacific cultures, because these are things that all humans experience and have names for, but those names either get lost or else most people don't know what you mean when you say it, right? So I made a video DVD called Woman Shaman and the Ancients in trying to document just what your question is asking, because my initial contact with this was through reading Mircea Eliade's book Shamanism in the early 70s. And his position was really resolutely sexist. He claimed that shamanism was a male hunter phenomenon, that only in its decadence were women allowed into it. And this went against some of his own evidence, because he talks about the Wu priestesses in China and the Völler in Scandinavia, but only to say, well, these are decadent, these are late, this is not the real deal. It's really the male hunter, And so there was a lot of problems with his approach, but that was a starting point for a lot of people. Then you have, I've been doing this research ever since the early 70s and documenting first the North Asian tradition of female shamans, and then looking at instances for, say, the Greek oracles or the witches in Europe under various different names, de-demonizing these figures, as the shamans also were in colonial contexts, and trying to see, well, what's out there? What can we find? And so, there you have to often look into orature. So, for example, again, in Mali, there are legends of the Soroko people or the Boso people that talk about Pasini Jobu, who was the greatest of the Tungutos. Her power of healing was so great she could even revive from the dead. And so there's a whole story about her. And a similar story that's also told about from Manchuria, now part of northeastern China, about Nisan Shaman. So this is a Tungusic speaking culture, the Manchus. And the word shaman is being used for a woman. Okay. And this is in Tungusic, it was a term that could apply either to a male or a female, you know. And a lot of those males were gender variant as well. So that there is this undertow, or this substratum, we could say, of an idea, as Maria Chaplica heard from a Chukchi woman or Chukchi person when she was up there in the far northeast of Asia. Woman is by nature a shaman. This is what the Siberian person told her. So that men who become shamans in a great variety of cultures around the world often take on feminine dress attributes, and even in the case of the Chukchi, speak in the female dialect, because they have a male dialect and a female dialect. Mm. And so this is also true of the Machi in Chile, in the Mapuche culture, predominantly female, but some gender variant males, maybe some other males. And so there are all these patterns to look at. So what I wanted to do is go back through the archaeology and pull together all the images that I had about this and kind of put them all together and make a movie from it. And in doing that, it was really interesting, because what I was saying before about pattern recognition, this really came up. I had this whole collection and I was sort of sorting them thematically. And I was surprised to find, I probably shouldn't have been with the witch's wand, but staffs was a major theme that occurs in Southern Africa, in Colombia. Of course, you got the European examples, but there are many other examples of women with staves all over the place. And there's a picture of a medicine woman with a staff in one of the Lakota winter calendars, winter count painted hides. Mm-hmm. So, we have to look. This is where interdisciplinary study is so crucial for all women's history. But in this case, especially, there's actually quite a predominance of women spiritual leaders among the women we know of historically. And so whether we call them medicine women, shamans, strege, vuller, all of these different ethnic names, the Makewana of the Chewa people in Malawi, then the Wu of China, the Mikogami of Japan, the Mudang of Korea. There's countless examples. The Isongoma of Southern Africa. There's this pattern of women's leadership very often being the spiritual sphere. And I did another presentation, which I do have on my Suppressed Histories portal, called Rebel Shamans, Women Confront Empire, because there's also this pattern of which the medicine woman or the seeress, who is a leader with responsibility to her people, when they come under conquest or invasion, they rise up and often lead the resistance. And so there's just so many examples of that. I first became aware of this pattern when I was making my first DVD, Women's Power and Global Perspective. And I realized that the women I had a section on women who were leaders in these insurrections and revolts against colonial rule, how many of them were called spirit diviners or priestesses or what have you. And so I started a new show. At that time, I could pick out maybe about 38 examples of women, which could include, for example, Joan of Arc. She was a dreamer. She, within a Catholic framework, but a peasant folk culture, had visions of saints who were telling her, you're going to go save France. You have to go fight against the English invaders, And she was accused of being a witch early on, as well as her final execution, even before she was allowed to become an advisor to the king and the French resistance. They forced her to undergo an examination by a midwife to determine that she was, in fact, a virgin. Because if she wasn't, that would mean she was a witch, right? Sex with the devil. So there's just all these examples. And finally, what I wound up was a visual talk that is so huge, I can't even fit everything in it anymore, because that pattern is so pronounced, But yeah, there's these groupings of themes that we can start to pick out. whether it's the sacred mirror or the bundle of herbs held in the hand. And you see this in Yoruba culture. You see it just over a whole wide expanse. The ancient Greek ceramic paintings, there's a whole theme of women either line dancing or round dancing, and their hands are joined, and in their joined hands are fronds of greenery. And this starts in the Mycenaean and it goes all the way up to about 600 BCE, and then it stops.
Fascinating.
Yeah, so there's illustrations of that in my book, Women in Greek Mythography. Full title, Pythias, Melissae, and Titanides. So I'm looking a lot at the oracular women, particularly in the last chapter there. The Oracle of Delphi, the black doves, the Pleiades of Dodona up near the Albanian border, when that oak grove up in the wild mountains was said to be the oldest oracle in Greece. So, yeah.
Not to cut you off, but I wanted to go into the rebel shaman. I wanted to ask about dreams and the significance of dreams.
Uh-huh.
So, can I share content real quick?
Oh, yeah. Let me.
Okay. Thank you. So, I was watching one of your videos, Max, and I didn't actually know you were an artist when I found your archives, but you shared a bunch of your art in this video, and I was really struck.
Yeah.
Yes, which I love. I was like, oh my God, there's even more. And now there's art by you. So I want to share one of the art pieces that I screenshotted because it really speaks to this theme of dreams that I've been looking at. Those are my notes.
Uh-huh.
So here it is.
This
is How Should It Be Otherwise? I love this. And it actually reminds me of a dream that I had. So I had a dream. Oh, that's my dog growling. I had a dream that was actually really disturbing. First, I was quiet pups. First, I was cornered off in a clearing, and there was another girl with me. There was a whole bunch of people with me, and all of a sudden we were being shot up, and I saw the girl get shot right in front of me. And then, and then in the next part of my dream, I was in what felt like a Catholic church, and I heard this priest narrating like his life, almost like with such self-importance and grandeur. But I knew that this priest was like a terrible abuser just based on my own dream context. And so it was a very disturbing dream. And I ended up running out of the church, and I ended up on a big bridge. And from my left came this lion-faced goddess, and she just was huge, and she started destroying the everything. She was destroying the building, and so it felt really symbolic of kind of like this militarism and this patriarchal religion being destroyed, showing like the horror of it, but like this goddess appearing and just wrecking it and saying, oh, this is enough. And so I love this piece by you. I'm just going to read. For conquerors have ever tightened their grip as they hatefully crushed the vastly ancient way that mothered our ancestors, crushed it from women's hearts. But blind are they who have aimed at destruction of source life. Blind indeed, for there surrounding them, unseen, whirl the worlds of witching, known as the dream time. For power is never lost in truth, life never extinguished. So I love this piece. I'm going to stop sharing screen. I wondered if you could just talk about the power of dreams a little bit.
Yeah. Well, even that drawing was a kind of dreaming.
Yes.
I was in a period, I'd only been doing this research for 3 years at that point. And it was just kind of pouring out through my pen, like I was dreaming. It was a waking dream of dreaming worlds in which women are free, which the relationality was still intact. The web of life was vibrant and respected. There's no cutting through all of that, no crushing of that, because that to me, I mean, I was walking in a totally man-made world. I had nothing, you're just struggling to keep a roof over your head. Everything's paved, I longed with all my heart to be on the land and to walk in the forests and the mountains and by rivers. And it was really hard for me to get to those places, but I would hitchhike out to do that, and just try to get on the land as much as I could, because that was unmediated reality. It was not man constructed, and this whole Euro conquest paved over reality here in North America, where it's just like it's so not only antithetical to nature but anti-nature, really destructive of the biosphere. And so that was a dreaming, because I was kind of playing around with comics, graphic novels, I guess we could call it now, because they weren't supposed to be funnies, but to really address what happened. How did patriarchy come about? How do women resist it? How were we subjugated? What are the means through which that can be overthrown? So that piece came out of that sensibility. And also there's a little bit of a comic book sensibility in that, and some of the earlier stuff I did, because I used to love comic books. I read comic books. And so there's a certain kind of a ironic style, like in the language of that's kind of over dramatized. My Witch Dream comic, which I did publish in 1976, has a lot of that. And I'm going to do another show on that eventually, that will be included in the show that's more about my graphic design and political posters and that kind of stuff. But that visualization, the re-envisioning of other cultural possibilities, other cultural worlds for ourselves, is a dreaming.
Yes.
Wow.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That is just so rich. And
I love that you love that one, by the way. I mean, that was just, that was all my heart was in that. If I had to do it over again, I mean, dream time, I would not have used the word dream time, which really has, cultural specificity to Aboriginal Australians. But, it's such an evocative term, because, we need names in our language also to describe these deep layers of reality, not just the surface crust that's created by, capitalist production system, and the media framing of what humans are and can be, and especially women, but, to just really go deep and find what's that cross historical reality of humanity, or even just the consciousness that's embedded in all being, the stones, the trees, all the beings. Animacy is what Robin Wall Kimmerer calls it, the Potawatomi. She's a botanist, but I think of her as a philosopher.
So I think I have to call it, Max. I think we could listen to you for 3 hours, 4,
yes.
5, like we're in a lecture hall. But I was trying to think if I had any final questions, but nothing's coming to mind. But I don't know if you've listened to the show or not, Max, but at the end of every show, for guests who haven't been on before, I ask everybody the same 3 questions. Are you ready for that? This is the fun part. I mean, it's all fun, but this is the really fun part.
All right.
So, first question, tell us something about yourself that people who know you would be surprised to learn.
Oh gosh, this is coming out of left field. I'd have to think about that to really answer it. Goodness. What don't they know about me? I don't know. I mean, it's just like the people who are close to me. I don't know if there's any secrets really. Don't know. I don't know what to say to that.
Some little quirk?
Well, I have lots of quirks, but I think they're okay, give me the other questions. Maybe I'll think of something.
Okay. So the second question is, what is your current favorite TV series or movie?
Okay, so I don't watch television. I tend to like kind of stream things on YouTube, and
Okay.
I'm mostly either streaming music or else I'm streaming history or political stuff. Um, I did like The Diplomat a lot. I saw that on
Okay.
Netflix,
Okay.
and then
I love that show. So
it ended with a cliffhanger, and I'm like, no, I have to
right.
wait a year, and then now they might not even fund the production of that was very well done. And I
Yes.
also really loved La Cocinera de Castamar, which is a Spanish historical movie series about a woman who becomes a cook in a noble household, and it's in the 17th century, early 1700s, I guess I would say.
Okay.
Just really well. So I have an answer for you on that.
Okay. Well, I read that The Diplomat was renewed for a second season, so we just have to
Yay.
hang
Just have to
tight.
wait it out.
Yeah. And the third question, the final question is if your life were a movie, what would be the theme song on the soundtrack?
Probably a song by Zahava Ben, one of her favorite musicians. Mizrahi music out of the Arab and the Arab Jews, North African, West Asian Jews.
Okay. You'll have to send me a link.
Yeah. Oh, it's great music.
Okay.
It would definitely be one of those. I could maybe even think of a title if I had more time.
Okay. Well, you could send it to me. We've got time.
Okay. Yeah.
And I do have a public playlist on Spotify and iTunes of that answer to this question I think there's only the first two seasons up there. I've got to put up season 3. So this will get
I'll
added
ask
to
her and get a title for you. How's that?
Okay. This will get added to that queue. And I have to say, it's quite an eclectic mix, as you can imagine.
Yes. Yeah, I'm very into ethnomusicology myself, so I have some playlists on YouTube that kind of span the waterfront there
Okay.
internationally. I just
Cool.
want to also mention to people, to look for my book, Women in Greek Mythography, on Valletta Press. It's the only place you can get it from because I'm fighting not to have it on Amazon.
Are you?
They
Okay.
take
I
everything.
wondered about that because it does come up like when you Google it, it'll come just Google again.
Yeah.
Give me the short answer, which of course sent me to Amazon first, but I went to the Valletta site and found it there as well. So
Yeah. Witches and Pagans is available from other outlets because I sold out the print run, but this one
okay.
I have 2,000 books I want to sell before I kick it over to the online retailers. And that's book 1 of my series on the Greeks, and the second book is called Women's Power in Greek Patriarchy. And so that's the volume that's going to have the Amazons and various quote unquote barbarian women that don't fit Greek patriarchal standards. And so
Right.
Medea, Kirke, and all those figures are in there, as well as women philosophers. And we have Aspasia and a lot of other figures like that. And a very historical chapter the book actually kicks off with on Greek patriarchy and how that was structured. Because, we just have these generalizations, but when you just really get down into the details and see how it was, it's a consciousness raiser about, the
Yes.
colonization of women, basically.
All right. Dominique, any closing thoughts?
Just thank you so much. I'm looking forward to hearing more about what was the name of the comic that you released?
Witchstream Comics.
Witchstream Comics. I'm looking forward to hearing more about that.
Yeah,
that's fun.
and then it was published. It was published by the Women's Press Collective, Oakland Women's Press Collective, in 1976. And of course, the print run, it's like a total collector's item now because maybe there's a few copies out there, but not many.
Do you have one?
So I do. I gotta find where my copy is. It's like buried in the archives somewhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Once you
I
do, I
have
would
it
love to see it.
digitally. Yeah.
Oh, perfect.
It's very much in comic book style, Thence sprang the Amazons. Very, that kind of flavor.
I love it though. Like
complete with ads. I don't know, the old comic books of the 60s, they would have ads in there about the 90-pound weakling who got sand kicked in his face by the big bully, and how you have to club and, lift weights in order to build yourself up, and then you can, confront the bully. So I have one that's cast in feminist terms about women fight rape, join your local dojo, learn martial arts, fight back.
Oh, I love it.
But it's kind of cast in a little bit in that mold, just taking off on that.
That's exciting. We're kind of talking about how are we going to get this information, this material out to other generations. And sometimes I feel like mixed media, maybe like comic book form, and even like I'm really into storytelling. I'm into video games and also animated films and shows. So I think that those mediums might really be able to convey some of the huge collection of work that we are citing from.
That's my goal. I mean, I've been
Yeah.
working 7 years knocking this book out because the
Yeah.
Greek material was just so vast. That's how long it took. But I really want to do more animated film. And I don't mean like as in the sense of animation like cartoons, but like compositing videos, animating stills, because I have all these stills that I would like women to see that just kind of not click slide, but just to really zoom in and then have the background and have a map here and, just really showing cultural worlds like that.
So Max, I need to introduce you to Dale Allen. Dale Allen, have you heard of her? Yeah,
Yeah.
and that's her big thing is video production. So she can probably point you in the right direction of how to do the kinds of things that you want to do. And because
Yeah.
she just did her
Well, I was
film
on that
in
learning
Our
curve
Right Minds.
with Woman Shaman. But and the other thing I'm going to do, because I do have to stay off the computer more, is I'm going to start doing more storytelling or recording of audio podcasts, just to, really, there's so many subjects to cover. And it's like a lot of my work has been in sharing the visual, but there are things we don't have visual for. Like, the course I'm going to teach next year in 2024 is called Rematriating and Understanding Patriarchy. Because understanding patriarchy, it's like there's something structural that we can name. We can show known patterns of how women's bodies are colonized and the systems of control and the violent punishments that are enacted to keep women in those boxes. And so we need an analysis of that on an international level. We can give specific examples of here's how it happened here or there, but to really be able to really establish that there's frameworks, there are strategies that are used, and there are strategies women also use to resist. It's a layered phenomenon. It's layer upon layer upon layer of colonizing culture, and law, custom, religion, all these things that combine. Family structure, marrying women out. That's a whole big part of it. Or marriage by capture. That's sometimes a part of it. And that leads to women being recast as people who can be colonized, who can be enslaved easily. So I'm going to be doing more of that as well, just because writing a book with the formatting and the footnotes, I mean, it just takes too long, so more audio and more video. Start getting more of the stream on demand out is the other goal that I have, because the visual does have this advantage. It's the real evidence. Whatever I may say about it, what others may say about it, those young women can look at that and see entirely different ways of being female. Embodied, stout, strong female bodies who are not posing and simpering. It's a media culture magnetizes us so heavily, especially as we're forming our individual personality. They want us crushed within these molds. It's all structured around how do I look, and is anybody going to think that I look weird? They just to really be able to stand in the world. That's what the ancient figurines, the ancient female icons are doing. They're standing in their power. They're strong. They're broad shouldered. They're looking out at you. and they're holding power. It's visible in them. And so to be able to be exposed to that and say, this is world history. Women's history is world history. We are culture makers. We have done these things that they have withheld from us knowledge. We desperately need this knowledge as medicine for the spirit. So that's my goal, to be able to get as much of that out there as I can. So, I opened up Instagram. I'm finally posting on Instagram. There'll be more YouTube videos. That's the open access side of the videos that I'm doing. And pour it out. Just pour it out.
Oh, again, Max, I really, from the bottom of my heart, really, I've talked to a lot of people over 4 seasons, but this was one of the episodes that I looked forward to the most. And when I reached out to you and you said yes, I immediately texted Dominique because I know that she was also a very big fan. So thank you again. Thanks for
It
coming
was
on
my
the show.
pleasure. And it's great to meet both of you. So I'm going to, if you want to send me your emails, I'll also put you on my mailing list so that you can, I'm going to be doing more podcasts again. I stopped webcasts for the whole year practically.
Okay.
And the course will start up again in 2024. But even if you're not in the course, the monthly webcasts you can still access.
Okay.
By subscription individually. So if there's one you're interested in, that way you'll know about it.
Okay.
And
all right.
I look for, I have to figure out, I want to listen to more of your programs. I mean, I just loved what you did with there was the Brazilian one. Can't remember the title of it anymore, but
was it Rosa? I know which one you're talking about.
Yeah.
Slave
and
to
I thought,
judge your souls.
okay, she's this is good, deep stuff. I mean, I like it when it's like somebody who really has, it's meaty, it's like, it's not all generalization. She's talking about an actual instance and, then an analysis of that, and it was a valuable story. So I actually posted, I was going to post it. I need to listen to the whole thing. I'm going to post about it on the Suppress Histories page on Facebook.
Yeah,
because
her podcast, Her Half of History, I think you'd find really interesting. The woman that I had on the show that did that episode has her own podcast called Her Half of History.
Okay. Yeah, it's just like walking, cooking, cleaning the house. That's when I listen to this stuff. But then I have to stop and scribble things down when it's really good. Because can't let this go by, So, I look forward to seeing the rest of what you have eventually, or hearing it rather.
All right,
Dominique, who knows what you're going to come up with? I'll stay tuned to that.
Yeah, we're watching you.
Yeah, will be.
You're our future.
I will say this, there's a whole new wave happening. I know a lot of young women who wish they were alive in the 70s, because there was this wave, this crest that happened of this explosion of women's energy, just really in all directions. And then, the backlash that began around the time of the Reagan administration, going forward, we've had backlash and more backlash and more backlash, and women have been constrained and shrunken culturally. Even our ability to speak is being challenged in public in different ways. That I'm starting to see a lot of, there's a new young women's movement coming up, that is really hungry for something different than what mass culture has been shoving down all our throats. And so I think what's happening now is you're all just starting to find each other and us. I mean, I don't want to be a separate thing at all. It's just sort of like, we're waiting for you all. And we're like, where are they? How do we find them?
We didn't know you existed. That is the wild thing to me.
We didn't for a long time, but now we do. And
we know.
I know what you're saying, Max. I see that with myself and Lori Davis, the woman who does Her Half of History, and Dr. Carla Ionescu with the Goddess Project podcast, and Liz Kelly's podcast, Home to Her. We are all having women like you and other women who are from these foremothers, what we consider our foremothers who came up in the 70s, goddess spirituality. We're now having all of you on our podcasts,
Yeah.
which is a
Yeah. Well,
great way for us to disseminate this
totally.
information. I mean,
Yeah.
Karen Tate's been around since the 90s. This coming season, I have Marilyn Nyborg and Dale Allen and all of these other women who, who like knew Carol Christ. And, so yeah,
I
it's
knew
really, I see the intergenerational thing happening and feel like I'm in the
Well,
middle of that. But people my age, we're starting to get tired. So now we're looking to people like Dominique to pass on our information that we learned from your generation. We're passing that down.
and we're all still here right now, so it's
Yeah.
just like, let's create a common bowl,
Yeah.
Yes.
let's pass the bowl around, and that can happen.
Yeah. I was able to talk to Louisa Tish, and I mentioned we talked about your work, and we were supposed to have Charlene Sprint.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
Louisa, she's a huge fan and lover of you.
Oh, I know, she's amazing. I've known her for decades. Oh, I know what I was going to think of. And she came out with this new book.
Yes.
So, she invited me to be part of that. I was very honored by that. There's a new movie out by somebody named Laura Hirsch, German filmmaker. And I've just watched the first 3 episodes of it are out. So I was interviewed. It's actually about foremothers of the women's spirituality movement. And I just watched the episode 2 is on Maria Gimbutas. And it's so good. It's about her life, but it's also about the backlash against her. And Charlene Spretnak especially throws down about the way they treated her and how they locked her out. And, she's she wrote a great article about that as well, which I always recommend to people. But anyway, that's
we are reading Maria Gimbutas now,
uh-huh.
who I didn't know existed before, I don't know, 6-7 years ago. So
well, most people, yeah. So and really, what's happening is a whole constellation of women. I mentioned Robin Wall Kimmerer, and then there's just so many from so many different cultural directions. Louisa holds ground and has for a long time for African American women's spirituality. She studied with Catherine Dunham, who was part of this whole Afrocentric dance movement, reclamation, that really had a lot, even aligned to Zora Neale Hurston. There was like this underground search of African American women who wanted to reclaim it. And what they found was the ceremonial culture, the dance, the incantation. A lot of those women made ocha and joined the Lukumi tradition or other African religions. But there's just so much in my lesbian feminist world. I knew one African American from Philly and another Puerto Rican woman from the Bronx, who were both butches who played conga, and they had grown up around the drumming. So there was a period in the early 70s of this very male chauvinist attitude of, no, in Africa, women don't drum. You're supposed to stand respectfully behind men drum, and they were not having that at all. They just go in there and they throw down with their congas, and the men realized they could really drum. So they got, they made their way in.
Yes.
There's just so many aspects to women's spirituality, that all these different cultural expressions of it, for women of many heritages. And so that's something that, we're going to continue to see more books being published, from Native voices, and not about Native history, but from Native sources, and that's going to be invaluable. It already is. There's already a bunch of. So thank you, and look forward to hearing from you when it's all ready, and we meet again sometime.
We will. I will be in touch, and I will talk to you, Dominique. But until then, I wish both of you the love and the peace of the goddess. All right, ladies.
Thank
we'll
you.
Talk soon.
Okay, ciao, babies.
Thanks Thanks for watching or listening to The Girlfriend God. Don't forget to like, rate, review, subscribe, follow, and comment. Episodes drop every Saturday morning at 8 a.m. and you can follow The Girlfriend God on social media on Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook.